Tactical communication. The ability to communicate effectively is an essential and valuable skill, particularly for those in security, because at times the conversations you're having may have a very significant outcome depending on how they go. Communication is not just the words we say. We know that our non-verbal markers, like our body language and facial expressions, and our tone, how we speak, have more impact than the words we actually say. This is essential to know because you have no chance of getting your message across if your expression, your body language, and your tone are not in line with the words you're saying. When we speak to someone who may be emotionally disturbed or suffering mental illness, the effects of drugs or alcohol, or simply someone from another culture with different communication styles, what we say and how we say it will be critical to achieving the results we intended. There's a reason you're speaking with someone. Perhaps it's to order a coffee. Perhaps it's a professional meeting. Perhaps it's a job interview. Perhaps it's a rapidly escalating situation you must control to avoid violence or harm to yourself or others. And in all these situations, you aren't speaking for the sake of it. You are speaking with the aim of achieving a desired outcome, to ensure that you receive the coffee that you want, to impart the knowledge and appear professional to your colleagues, to win a position, or to diffuse a violent situation. So, with this in mind, the takeaway is that you need your conversation to have a goal, an outcome that you're trying to achieve. In the case of a potentially violent situation, the goal will be to obtain voluntary compliance from the subject. That is, to get them to do what you want them to do, but on their own. And from what we've learned so far, what you actually say is less important than how you say it, and even less important than how the subject receives and interprets what you're saying. Imagine a scenario where you're ordering a morning coffee. Imagine you approach the counter and you immediately begin beating your chest as hard as you can and screaming your order across the counter. Do you think you'd be getting your coffee? Or do you think that everyone would have been so scared and the poor attendant would be hiding behind the counter? It's likely in that scenario that no one would even have heard or digested properly the words you said because they would have been too shocked or scared to comprehend. So in this case, you clearly haven't achieved your communication goal, which was to get your morning coffee. The skill of tactical communication should be the bread and butter for crowd controllers and hospital security and university security. It's also a skill that many security professionals will need to call on when attempting to de-escalate a situation in any customer-facing position, or when interacting with someone who is about to or has just committed an offence on your site. For crowd controllers, how they speak to people every day will have a direct impact on how well they perform their duties professionally, how well their clients and patrons like them, and how many times their evictions and refusals turn physical. So when you're approaching to speak to someone, plan and understand what your goal is before you engage. What is it you're trying to achieve from this interaction? And with that in mind, you're much more likely to achieve your desired outcome. More so than in many jobs, how law enforcement, and yes, security is a form of law enforcement, speak to people, will have an obvious impact on the outcome, simply because the chances of speaking to someone whilst they're in an agitated state is higher than average. Before we dissect spoken communication further, we must simply understand that officer presence is a use of force listed in tactical options models. Simply, the presence of someone in uniform with a real or perceived authority will have an impact on the interaction. To highlight this with an exaggerated point, picture yourself in a shopping centre in an unfamiliar country where you don't speak the language. Imagine you're approached by 12 uniformed security staff who surround you so you feel you can't leave. Regardless of their reason for speaking with you, the chances are you're already intimidated and your communication response will be defensive or offensive as a result. They will be less likely to be able to convince you that they're simply there to check on your welfare or provide you with directions, even if that is the case. Simply by the way you dress, you're communicating something to others. Those whose uniform is wrinkled or shoes don't match the style of their uniform, whose shirt has a stain on it, whose hair isn't neat, silently communicate that they're unprofessional and they don't take pride in themselves or their job, and that they're likely lazy. A would-be offender is much more likely to target this officer, the one whose dress and bearing is immaculate, communicating that they're professional and dedicated. Once you approach the subject and begun communicating, with your goal of voluntary compliance in mind, your dress and bearing immaculate, your non-verbal communication congruent with your words, it's now time to think about what to say. And this might not be so easy if the other person doesn't want to or simply cannot communicate in the way you want to. Particularly in the case of intoxicated persons, you may find yourself going around and around in circles as they repeat their arguments over and over. Whilst physical force should always be a last resort, and of course lawful, justifiable, reasonable, proportionate, and necessary, there must be a time where you accept that verbal communication has failed and you must move on with other methods to achieve your goal. Part of the communication plan that you put in place must include how long you'll communicate for whilst attempting to obtain voluntary compliance, and when you'll move to non-voluntary compliance measures. This will depend on the environment, resources, company policies and procedures, staff capability and experience, and all of this should be taken into account when formulating your plan. Additionally, you must recognize your own emotional response to the communication exchange, particularly if the subject is intimidating you, and you must be honest in that process. This may make it harder to move to non-voluntary compliance action. So to make life simple, consider the following simple plan in conjunction with all legislative and compliance requirements. Ask, tell, make it happen. Put simply, ask the subject to do what you need them to do and provide a full explanation of how and why. If they refuse and you've exhausted all ways to ask them, then it's time to tell them what to do. If they're still failing to comply with your lawful directions, then it's time to make it happen. Consider this short scenario. A heavily intoxicated male is attempting to gain entry to a licensed premises. The crowd controllers have explained numerous times to the man that he's showing a number of signs of intoxication and so he cannot be let in. In his inebriated state, the man isn't getting the message and is continually repeating that his mates are inside and he's just here for a beer. It's now time to tell the man that he has to leave, as asking him didn't get a result. He's holding up the door, he's blocking access to other patrons, and he's taking the crowd controller away from their duties. This time, in a firm and professional tone, the man should be directed to leave in clear and concise language so that he can understand it. The tone of voice has now become further and congruent with our body language. In this case, the male doesn't take the hint, he continues to yell through the door to his friends inside. This continues with no end in sight, and he has clearly failed to comply with the communication voluntarily. So now it's time to make it happen. The crowd controller communicates with his colleagues and they coordinate to physically remove the male from the premises. They made it happen. The theory of ask, tell, make it happen keeps communication on track, provides clear and distinct points to move on to the next step, and this is a nice short tool that can be easily remembered to assist in tactical communication scenarios. For those that have the time to explore these theories further and in more detail, this expanded method of tactical communication is a fantastic tool to learn and practice. The acronym above, GIST and OR, is a tool that will guide you through communication process with clearly defined steps and triggers. It will also serve a number of purposes like providing your cue to your colleagues that communication strategies have failed and concluded, demonstrating to listening witnesses that you've exhausted all forms of reasonable communication, and it will provide a trigger to take physical action at times where you may be avoiding it. It will draw a line in the sand for you. GIST and OR stands for greet, identify, solve, thank, options, appeal, and react. Greet. The first thing any law enforcement or customer service member should do when they begin speaking to someone is greet them. This opens the conversation in the standard expected way and begins the rapport building process. It sets the tone for how the conversation should go, and it also gives you some insight into the subject's mood via their response to your greeting. Identify. Identify yourself and inform the subject why you're speaking to them. It's often best to give the subject your first name so they feel comfortable speaking to you, and then you'll probably have to let them know why you're engaging with them and what your position is to be engaging with them. Solve. If the subject is in the wrong place or seemingly doing the wrong thing, they may have a reason or a perceived reason for doing it. Whether their reason seems legitimate or justifiable to you at the time is irrelevant to them, as it's likely very important to them. They may simply move on when you explain things to them, but they may also be dedicated to their cause. This can be particularly apparent in cases of mental health issues or drug or alcohol affected people. The best way to address this is to find out what the problem is that the subject's facing and how it can be solved. It may be you can easily solve their problem without detracting from your duties, and it's likely that the subject won't comply with your directions until their problem is solved. Remember, at this point, you have to put away your ego. This is not about making demands for the sake of making demands. If we can assist in solving a problem, then that's probably better than taking directly punitive measures against someone. Thank. If you've been successful in all the steps so far in your communication, and you've managed to gain voluntary compliance from the subject, then take the time to thank the subject for their cooperation and say goodbye. Options. If, once you're in the solve phase and you're having no luck either determining what the situation is or how to solve it, or there is simply no safe, practical, or lawful way to solve it, then you must move to the second column of the acronym. It's now time to round up the conversation and stop trying to solve the subject's problem and provide them with options on how they can move forward. This is not a case of we can do this the easy way or the hard way. This is about providing genuine options that can provide a suitable outcome for you and hopefully for the subject too. It may involve simply calling a taxi for them. It may involve allowing them to use a phone. By providing options to the subject in a non-threatening way, you're showing a willingness to assist for as long as possible. Appeal. The following appeal serves a number of purposes and should sound something like this. Is there anything I can say or do to get you to follow my directions? By using this appeal phrase, you're doing a number of things. You're indicating to your team that you've exhausted all communication options, and that if the subject does not show direct compliance in response to the appeal phrase, then it's going to be time to make it happen. You're indicating to any witnesses that you've provided the subject with any and all reasonable opportunities to comply voluntarily. You're showing the subject through your now formal communication that you're no longer accepting the situation, and it's time for them to see you in your professional light. And you're drawing a line in the sand for yourself, as action must be taken immediately following the appeal phrase. If they don't comply, or you'll lose the opportunity. Remember that you can adapt the appeal phrase, or the end of it, to fit whatever situation you're trying to create. Is there anything I can say or do to get you to leave the premises? Is there anything I can say or do to get you to comply with my direction? React. React is as it sounds. If the appeal phrase fails to gain anything other than immediate voluntary compliance, or an answer that indicates that they'll comply on reasonable grounds, the next step is to take action, which may include arresting the subject or physically removing the subject from the premises, for example. If you train with your team on this lesson, you'll all be aware of this process, and your colleagues can be positioned already appropriately as they follow you through the gist and or process, and they'll be ready to take action as required. Everything we do when we're in the vicinity of another person is a form of communication with them. Even choosing not to look at someone or say something may send a message loud and clear that you're avoiding them, that you're intimidated, that you're rude and dismissing them. And all of those messages can have a negative impact and create a negative response. The success of your communication starts before you begin the conversation. It's in your presentation, it's in your tactical communication plan, and the goals that you set yourself in your verbal and non-verbal markers. By using the tools above, you'll keep yourself on track when the conversation is deteriorating or when stimulus causes you to lose track of your thoughts. It will provide your team with an understanding of where you're at without having to brief them or give them signals. And it will demonstrate your professionalism to colleagues, clients, witnesses, and the subject. There is a wealth of information on tactical communication, and further tools will be available by studying subjects like neurolinguistic programming or learning about things like rapport building by design. We hope this has been a useful start and it will be useful throughout your career. We encourage you to try this when training with your team or thinking through scenarios in your head at work, particularly scenario based training opportunities. Don't forget the appeal phrase because it's very useful in so many different scenarios. Is there anything I can say or do to get you to comply with my directions?